highlighting the topics that affect agriculture nationwide. It's the AgNet Weekly with Sabrina Halverson, brought to you by AgNet Media. And now, here's this week's featured conversation.
Named Best Book of the Year in the New Yorker and Publishers Weekly, Chicago Tribune, and EcoLit Books, and a must-read summer book by USA Today. The book, The Parrot and the Igloo, Climate and the Science of Denial by David Lipsky, takes a deep look into the history of climate change and public views on the topic. Lipsky is a New York Times bestselling author and contributing editor at Rolling Stone magazine. So when his publicist emailed and asked about being on our show to talk about the book, I was thrilled to agree. He's a very interesting author with several unique stories within a story. And so with that, I'm Sabrina Halverson. Let's get into this week's AgNet Weekly. Let's start out talking about climate change, and I love the subtitle to your book, The Science of Denial. What inspired you to write this?
Do you know the poet Robert Lowell?
I do.
Okay, so his wife Elizabeth Hardwick, wonderful writer and teacher of writing, and she told her writing classes at Columbia that there are only two good reasons to write anything. Those reasons are money or revenge. The reason that I was motivated to do this book was that I was working on a different project and I came across reporting about how long we've been aware of how global climate change works. Even saying the word and then learning where the word climate change comes from, I think I'm on the revenge spectrum.
All right. With that said, there's been so much dialogue about climate change. Is it actually happening? Is it not happening? Deniers and all of this has been going on for a couple of decades now, really. Was there anything surprising that you learned through the process of writing this book and in doing your research for it?
Oh, Sabrina, first off, I was surprised at how great a story it was. Normally what I do is narrative fiction and nonfiction. So learning what a wild story it was and how crazy a number of the people on the wrong side of the issue were. Just you think there as a writer, you think, wow, this would be a fun thing for me as a reader to get, and it will be really funny to tell. But yeah, the whole thing was a surprise. I had the sense, like everybody else, a kind of lazy sense where different news issues nudge you and then you turn around and they're gone and you try to hear, hey, what were they saying about that? I had the impression that we kind of first started hearing about climate in the late 80s and early 90s. And then it first became a political issue because in the same year, former Vice President Gore received two really important prizes, the Nobel Prize and then the important one, the Academy Award. So I thought that that's when we started talking about it. I was working on something else. And you heard the sigh, that is the revenge part of me rising back into the surface of my body, taking control of the vocal apparatus. In the 1950s, the first great American climatologist warned us. 1956, in May, he warned us, in 50 years or so, this could have a violent effect on the world's climate. He wasn't warning it in the Journal of Applied Meteorology or in a climate journal like EOS. He warned that in Time magazine. And the headline wasn't abstruse. The headline was One Big Greenhouse. That shocked me. And then, Sabrina, did you see Oppenheimer?
I did.
Manhattan Project, right? That's who he is superintending. Those are the cats he's wrangling. Those extremely stubborn, brilliant physicists. The Manhattan Project gave us the atomic bomb, of course, and it also gave us radar. So it gave us our travel system, our air travel system. Then it broke up because the war was over. And about 10 years later, since the American defense establishment still had science needs, some people in the defense establishment said, hey, let's get the band back together. So the veterans of the Manhattan Project and then some new younger scientists were reformed as a group called JASON, who are great fun to read about. For a long time, no one even knew what their name meant. It actually comes from the Greek hero Jason and the Argonauts, who traveled sort of under arms into foreign lands, so voyages of exploration. And the Jasons, they're why we didn't use atomic weapons in Vietnam. And they also pioneered smart weaponry. So the Iron Dome that the Israelis have used to keep their nation free of missile attack, that is one of the predictable outgrowths of the kind of work that the Jasons have always done. In the 70s, the Jasons warned the White House that the climate change, the global warming that people like Professor Revelle had talked about in the 50s, that it was coming. The report, the phrasing in the report was, "This is ominous." The chairman of the report, this is not in an out of the way place. This was in the New York Times. The chairman of the report told the New York Times in the spring of 1979, government must start dealing with this issue now. It's going to be here by the 1990s. In the late spring of that year, President Carter turned to the National Academy of Sciences. Sabrina, you of course know what the National Academy of Sciences is, but as a trivia question, do you know who started it?
I don't.
President Lincoln. And
Oh.
President Lincoln started it because, we were in an industrial age, and it was clear that we would need an outstanding body of scientists to whom government at the highest levels could turn to settle important questions of science. What the National Academy of Sciences is, there are millions of people who have PhDs and also advanced engineering degrees in America. About 2,200 of them at any given time are elevated to join the National Academy of Sciences. It's kind of like being in the Football Hall of Fame while you're also still on the field playing professional football. So President Carter received this extremely worrisome report from the Jasons. They are the inheritors and the veterans of the project that Oppenheimer started. And they were saying this is going to be happening by 1990. And he asked the National Academy of Sciences, is it true? And in late July of 1979, they wrote back with their answer. And what they said was the results of this survey will be reassuring to scientists, because scientists don't like to be wrong about what they've been researching, but disturbing to policymakers. If the carbon dioxide release continues, this panel finds no reason to doubt that climate changes will occur and no reason to believe that those climate changes will be negligible. And we had that tremendous head start of a warning, July 29th of 1979, and we did what we all know we've done. And so that revenge aspect, both bringing that news and talking about how that happened, that's why I wrote the book.
You brought actually some memories back because I remember in high school, which would have been in the 90s, being concerned about, well, back then we called it the greenhouse effect
Hmm.
and global warming. But my dad was a scientist. And so we were, I was kind of taught about those things, raised up with them. But I also recall being one of the very few people who knew about it and cared. And so it seems like we've had this discussion for a long time, but it's been, I want to use the cliche term under the radar. It's been such a difficult conversation because so many people were not believing the science. Now, did you broach that subject in your book?
I did, of course, but I will say, Sabrina, that here's a weird thing about us as people. I think we are people who are driven by fear and the desire for challenge, and then also driven by fashion. So, for example, calling it the science, that's something that reassures people like you and I who want to sound right when we're talking about what we feel are important issues. But to the people hearing us, they also know, they're doing that science talk. And so it makes their brains go a little fuzzy. And I think it makes their ears kind of a little sleepy. The president is told by the National Academy of Sciences in no uncertain terms, this is going to happen. And then in 1988, the next great American climate scientist, and probably the most famous climate scientist in the world, a man named James Hansen, he tells the Congress on June 23rd, 1988. So we just passed the anniversary of it. The greenhouse effect, that was the old name for it, the greenhouse effect has been detected and it is changing the climate now. Now, the interesting thing is what we were going to do, and it did seem like it's great that your dad was telling you to be aware of it. The scientists, they had been following it as a question since the 19th century, and they had been following it closely since the mid 1950s. If you go back into the early part of the last century, this is how far back this issue goes. 1930s, you could pick up 1934, you could pick up the New York Times. And you could, this would be above the fold. So the way the newsprinters and the editors, the way they see the newspaper, you want the front page. But even if you have the great good fortune, Sabrina, of getting on the front page, The question is, are you below the fold in the bottom half of the page, or are you above the fold? This is above the fold, 1934. And there's a story on one side of the newspaper above the fold is we really got to put Al Capone's speakeasies out of business. These speakeasies are a problem. And on the far right, it should be, there's a story about the Nazi Party promising to end attacks on Jews in the Reich. So Al Capone, Adolf Hitler, and between it is a story about global warming. America in the midst of 25-year heat wave, it's the longest consistent rising of heat in this country since 1776. Experts are baffled. So it was a mainstream issue by the 1950s. Then scientists, same way that they'll spend a decade or two looking at a promising new drug. The big reports after we understand by the 50s it's going to come sooner. Those big reports come to the White House. President is told by the National Academy of Sciences, you have to act on this now. He got two other reports that same spring, one from the Department of Energy, which said it's the biggest problem we're facing, and then another from the Council on Environmental Quality, which only exists to give warnings to the president, saying that this is absolutely going to happen in the next decade or so. The head of that report said, I expect this to be extremely influential in government decision-making circles. Told that to the Times. And he was right. The next president immediately tried to close down the Council on Environmental Quality. But one of the reasons, and it was fun to write about, one of the reasons that we didn't do anything about it, both the climate scientists think, and then the research in this book kind of confirmed, is the sort of society that we live in. God, what a terrible phrase. The country that we built became mature sort of around 1979, the same year that those warnings came in, by which I mean the people whose jobs it is to change our opinions so that, Sabrina, if I were to open up the top of my head and to look at the opinions I hold dear, my sense is that 8 out of 10 of them, 80% of them are just my David opinions. But if I were to really look with that kind of blue spray that they use on CSI or Law and Order, I would see that probably more than half of them, probably 2/3 of them, have fingerprints on them, and the fingerprints are from sort of professional opinion creators. You may have noticed that I keep trying not to say climate change, and it's kind of why phrases like the science make me bristle a tiny bit because of all those fingerprints. But did you notice that I was trying to avoid saying climate change?
I hadn't noticed, but now that you mention it, yes.
Okay. You were pointing out that it used to be called the greenhouse effect. And then the phrase that scientists liked was global warming. What they're anxious about is when we generate electricity and when we use cars and airplanes, some portion of the smoke that we put out of the tailpipes and out of the smokestacks, some portion of it contains carbon dioxide. And as we put more carbon dioxide into the air, it increases how much heat from the sun gets trapped in the system. And so the anxiety that we've always had is that it seems as if we can adapt to a temperature range of like 1 or 2 degrees Fahrenheit. When you get up to 3, 4, or 5 degrees Fahrenheit temperature raise, that's when, for example, the Secretary of Energy under President Obama, a great physicist, Nobel physicist named Steve Cho, that he says that's really non-adaptable bad. So it is warming that we're afraid of. In the late 90s, that same decade you were talking about before, a brilliant Republican opinion strategist, a man named Frank Luntz, was being paid by the Republican Party to come up with ways to deal with the problem of the environment because it was an issue that the Democrats, quote, own. And so one of the strategies he advocated is stop saying global warming. The phrase global warming has, quote, catastrophic connotations associated with it. Instead, make sure to always say climate change, because climate change sounds like a manageable challenge. Climate change sounds like flying from Ohio to Fort Lauderdale in December and January. And that suggests something that we can easily solve. So please do what you can to get people saying climate change and not global warming. That is one of the reasons why we've been slow to do whatever it is that needs to be done on this particular issue.
So would you like to see a movement taking it back to global warming then? Being called global warming?
Well, no, I think it's important to recognize the phrasing that we use. For example, like when people say denial, and denial is in the title of my book, There's a weird thing. Sabrina, do you talk about this often with people that you know? I'm going to say climate change too, because I have that same desperate urge that we feel when we're talking. It's almost like our shoulders tighten. I want to use the right phrase, the phrase that we're using in the last couple of years. So even now, I still want to say climate change, even though I know that that phrase has Frank Luntz's fingerprints on it. But do you talk about it a lot with people, climate
I
change?
do. Yeah, I do.
Do you find the same thing? So here's what I find when I talk about it with people. They face turns. One thing you learn the minute you talk with someone about this is you learn what they think of as their serious face. When you were talking to them before about the new Game of Thrones prequel, or when you were talking about them about vacation plans or about their favorite cheese stick. Me and my friends always compare cheese sticks because they're so portable and they're full of protein. You're seeing their real face. The minute you bring up climate change, you're seeing the face they think is appropriate for a serious topic. And their voice changes. It gets a little fakey sounding. And so it seems like when you bring it up, you're talking with them about a relative they forgot they had, and you're telling them that that relative is ill. And they're trying to sound serious, and they're hoping the conversation will soon change. And I think we've gotten used to doing that. And we've gotten used to doing it on a leadership level too, in a way that then has allowed this problem to persist. Do you find the same thing when you bring it up? What expression do you see in your friends and what voice do you hear them using?
Well, I think that my conversations are maybe a little bit, just a little bit different because I'm thinking of conversations I have with farmers. A lot of the reporting I do is agriculture, and I
Ah,
also talk a lot about agriculture policies. So I'm talking with people who are kind of in the thick of it, dealing with having to change how they're working their crops because they have noticed
of
things
course. Yeah.
changing. So it's a little bit different rather than just, if I were to talk to my sister who does not farm at all, or something like that, I guess.
Well, how did the farmers respond? Because one of my favorite things is something like the subtitle of this book is about the people who were professional about lying, basically, and the people who were professional at lying about science. And this is just for farmers, this is the easiest way to understand who the scientists, who the other team was. And even though the denial scientists did an amazing job, it was pretty much always the Harlem Globetrotters versus the Washington Generals. The Globetrotters were a tremendously talented basketball exhibition team, and they would travel around America and they would play a team that was called the Washington Generals, who were incompetent and always lost to them. And so the denial scientists, here's a good example of how effective they were at their jobs. Patrick Michaels, who's in their starting five, he's one of the most famous denial scientists. In 1992, he wrote, 20 years from now, we will more fully appreciate the effects of modest warming and CO2 enhancement. Again, that's that fingerprints of someone else's management on our thoughts. He doesn't want to say adding CO2 to the environment. He says CO2 enhancement. That effect will be longer growing seasons, summer temperatures that do not change much. And so you just project from 1992 to 2012. 2012 was the then warmest year on record in the United States. And one plant biologist told Business Week that summer, quote, it's like farming in hell.
Yes.
So I
I will
imagine that. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sabrina.
no, I will say that the conversations I have on this topic have changed very dramatically in the last 10, 15 years. It used to be, and I hope I don't get in trouble with my listeners for saying this. I might, but 10 or 15 years ago, when I would have these conversations, I was talking with people who did not believe it was happening, who did not believe that the temperature of the earth was changing, or if it was, it wasn't that important. And it certainly wasn't caused by humans. It was just a natural turning of the earth. And now when I talk with people about it, I'm talking with people who are concerned about how these changes are affecting their crops and how they're having to relearn things or come up with new systems and adapt to changes, and but also how they're concerned and are wanting to do what they can to, help reduce the problem as much as possible. So I have seen a shift in thinking in the agriculture industry. Absolutely, between, now and 10 or 15 years ago, I would say.
Yeah, what's fascinating about that is among the effects that the climate scientists began warning. Okay, so here's a good example. This is what farmers, I imagine, are experiencing. Your dad, as a scientist, did he talk to you about what happened with the ozone in the 80s? Because
Yes.
it's okay. So how much of it do you remember? Do you want to tell our listeners?
I remember that quite a bit of it was blamed on my hairspray. Um,
Yes. Yes, it was just Sabrina. The scientist tracked it back to your household.
yes,
Uh,
my dad would tell me the hole in the ozone is right over my house.
it's great. Sabrina has it right, basically. So in the 30s, GM had a line. You didn't know we were going back to the 30s in GM, did you? But for the farm to table in the 30s, you needed to have refrigerators, especially for butter and eggs, which boiled faster than anything else. And so GM needed a non-toxic and non-flammable refrigerant. They turned to a scientist who had helped them remove lead from gasoline. And they said, can you make a refrigerant that is not poisonous and won't cause kitchens to go on fire in the middle of the night? His name was Thomas Midgley. And again, he had made them, millions of dollars by taking the knock out of car engines with leaded gasoline. People who were on the showroom floors selling cars, they referred to the no-knock gas as a gift from God. So it took years to do unleaded gasoline. It only took him like 3 days to come up with what were called chlorofluorocarbons. That's the hairspray that you helped ruin the ozone with. The CFCs, they were extremely useful compound you could use as the accelerant in aerosol cans, even during World War II, when they needed something to help spread insecticide for bug bomb. If you were a GI and you were going to fight in the Philippines or in the Solomons, you needed a way to kill the mosquitoes. And so CFCs were great there, and they were also great, obviously, in air conditioners. By the 70s, a scientist named Sherwood Rowland, who has one of the great quotes about climate change, which I hope we'll get to after this story, which the farm listeners will nod at once we're done because it is what they're experiencing. In 1973, Sherwood Rowland, who was going to win a Nobel Prize for this research, but didn't know it then, was reading the newspaper the way farmers will look at the almanac or will look at the newspaper weather section. He was just looking for something to experiment on. He had found the thing that had previously brought him the most attention. In the 1970s, people thought that there was too much mercury in tuna, and it was a result of commercial fishing. And so Rowland did what a scientist did. He tried to find old samples of tuna, old cans of tuna. And the oldest cans were in natural history museums. They were just fish that had been caught in the 1890s and the 1870s. And he unscrewed the lids and tested. And it turned out there had always been mercury in tuna. So he notices how many people outside of your household are using aerosol cans, especially for hairspray and for shaving cream and underarm deodorant. So it's a unisex, it's an all gender problem. And he's just curious what's happening to the CFCs once they go out of the spray can. Obviously, they're going into the air, and obviously, they have to go somewhere. So he gets a laser physicist, and they go over the research together. And what they discover is that those CFC molecules, each one of them can eat up between 10,000 and 100,000 molecules of ozone. Now, what the ozone layer is for people who didn't have the benefit of your scientist father, ozone layer is like SPF 35 for the whole planet. It's what stops us from getting skin cancer. Sun is a very powerful thing, and we evolved with this thin layer of ozone, which SPFs everybody and also dogs and farm animals, so that Australia, which is closer to what became the ozone hole, in Australia, the most common form of cancer in livestock is a sun-born cancer of the eyes, because we ate away so much ozone that if you just look up cattle Australia eye cancer, you'll see one of the results of the spray cans. Now, Sabrina, it wasn't your fault. You were just using a product. So their research shows them very quickly that it will eat up the ozone layer and it will cause more skin cancer. And so for 10 years, just the way we've thought about climate change for longer, for 70 years, for 10 years, it's like a run through of every argument we're going to have about climate change. God damn you, Frank Luntz, for giving me that word. It's on a computer. How do we know? There's too much profit to be made. If we try to control it here in America and in Europe, they'll just make it in China and India. It's not worth doing. One thing that Professor Rowland and the other scientist, Professor Molina, one thing they couldn't count on was if you introduce that much of a new compound into the atmosphere, you really don't know what it's going to do. And so in the middle 80s, there was a British scientific team that was working at the bottom of South America, and they kept getting these wild readings that were suggesting that there was a huge loss of ozone internationally, like a 40 or a 45% loss in ozone. And they did what any scientific team would do. They assumed that their instruments were busted. So they wrote back to England and said, please send us new instruments. Clearly, our machines are broken. But they had new instruments set. They tested it again, the same result. And it turned out that an American satellite, we were involved too, Nimbus 7, a NASA satellite, had been recording the same unprecedented drop in ozone, but the computer was programmed to resist what it considered garbagey information. So it assumed it was a glitch and it was not reporting this tremendous, unprecedented, and also unanticipated drop. There was a hole in the ozone layer that was as big as the continent of Antarctica. Now, instantly, after saying that it was impossible to legislate these extremely valuable chemicals, instantly it just took 2 years from 1987 to 1989 to legislate, to negotiate and bring into force what was called the Montreal Protocol to move us away from CFCs. But the thing that was meaningful to climate scientists was they had known, their equations told them that it would eat ozone, but it didn't tell them that it would create a hole. Similarly, the science has told us, scientific predictions and data have told us that carbon dioxide will increase the temperature if we double it between 4 and 11 degrees Fahrenheit. We've known that since 1895. What we don't know is how that will affect these very delicate systems. And one of the things that they're anxious about is what will be the ozone hole version of climate change. Because farmers know that if you make a summer on an average a few degrees warmer, all it means for people going to the beach or driving to the beach is they have to either crank their car windows all the way down or crank their AC all the way up. But for the bees who pollinate, or for the corn roots that have to extend into the soil, or to the soil that has to remain non-arid, a degree or two is a huge thing. And that's the ozone thing, is what the scientists have tried to communicate. We don't know what some of the bigger or subtler or scarier changes might be.
This is fascinating. I could talk with you all day. But before we do anything else, what was the quote that you wanted to get to?
So Sherwood Rowland, when that was over, he's a climate scientist, and a few years later, he won the Nobel. And he had been warning since 1974, and he had taken all of the hits that the climate scientists took. DuPont, who then became a really good citizen on global warming, DuPont hired scientists to say this is bad data. They floated organizations that sound like they're working, they're white hats. They sound like they're working the environmental side of the street, like the Atmosphere Education Bureau. Sounds good, but it turns out it's DuPont funding a company or funding an organization saying, let's just let them keep making these wonderful propellants for underarm deodorant and for shaving cream. And so he had those fights. DuPont kept saying, if you give us evidence that it's happening, we will certainly stop making them. He would provide more evidence, and they would say, we just need a little tiny bit more evidence. And then finally, when the giant hole was there, when the damage had already been done, Professor Rowland said this great thing. He said, what's the point of having developed a science well enough to make predictions if in the end all we're willing to do is stand around and wait for those predictions to come true?
That is a fantastic quote.
And then there's a punchline to it, which is, I mentioned Professor Jim Hansen, who is the world's most famous climate scientist. And about 5 years ago, he gave the answer. It's as if we don't know. We may as well not have known. Our behavior with regard to fuel would not have been any different.
And so does this spark that revenge side in you again?
Yes, absolutely. Well, not revenge, but also like, how did we, like, Sabrina, I know that you are mostly concerned with the environment as it affects growing, which of course people don't understand how absolutely dependent. So everything on Earth pretty much comes from the sun. Growing comes from the sun, and even the fuel comes from stuff that used to grow that grew because of the sun, and then has been baking underground for aeons and aeons. So obviously, you and the people listening to us now know how absolutely dependent we are on the people who actually go out and grow things. One of the funny things that people would say who didn't want to believe in, thank you, Frank Lunt's climate change, one of the things they would say is, we were warned in the 70s, I'm sure your dad talked about this too, we were warned about the population explosion and how soon there wouldn't be enough food and we'd all be starving and clawing at each other. But it seems like we got through the population bomb okay, so presumably this is fake too. Have you ever heard people say things like that?
I haven't, but maybe I'm not talking to people who are old enough to remember that.
Yeah, so there's a guy named Paul Ehrlich who then also went on to warn about global warming, and he wrote a book called The Population Bomb. So part of that deep pessimism in the 70s about our environment is based on the fact that projections showed that there would be more people on Earth very shortly than there would be food to feed them, than there would be food to put on plates to give them. The solution was agronomists. It isn't like they had the math wrong. Norman Borlaug, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name wrong, but he invented a kind of dwarf wheat that could grow anywhere. It had a shorter growing cycle and it could be grown in really unpromising conditions, in unpromising soil. And it's not that they had the data wrong, it's that farmers rose to the occasion and they found a way to grow enough wheat to continue to feed a planet that had unanticipated population growth. So it's not that the warnings were wrong. It's just that the people who have to shoulder the brunt of it, the farmers who have to grow the grains that we all eat, they were given seeds that they could grow anywhere.
There's a lot of mixed feelings about Norman Borlaug and everything that he came up with as well, but that's a whole nother
Wait, no,
story.
Sabrina, I've always considered him a hero.
I have
Norman
too.
Borlaug, what did he
Mhm.
do that was bad?
So it led to the GMO.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there are some, not in my industry and not my listeners, we are, fond of, we
No, of course.
understand
No,
GMOs,
exactly.
but yeah, I run into a lot of people who are very upset over GMOs.
Can we talk about that for a second? Because it's one of the funny things about, so it's so odd that the same people who would say the science, not you and me, but the same people who would say, listen to the scientists, listen to the science. What's wrong with you that you won't listen to science? Those same scientists would be like, yes, we live in an atmosphere of chemicals. We're made of chemicals. We have learned that if you put these certain chemicals into the ground, we can grow faster, bigger, better. Borlag, without that wheat, there would be millions, hundreds of millions of people who are dead.
Mhm.
Similarly, inside the politics of global warming, you know that despite the ambitious and altruistic targets that we keep setting for ourselves, we need to cut emissions by this amount. In 2018, that's the most recent occasion on which we were given an ambitious target. The IPCC came out in the fall of 2018 and rightly said that if we want to keep warming under 2 degrees, we have to cut worldwide emissions by 45% between 2018 and 2030. Now, obviously, internationally, we are nowhere close to that. In fact, we're up about 3%. But America has actually done pretty well. And America last year had a drop in its emissions, which is great and it's worth celebrating. One part of that is because 2005, 2006, we were generating probably about 51% of our electricity by coal. And coal, it's a great product. It has been wonderful for mankind, but it also releases more carbon dioxide. It puts more carbon dioxide into the air than oil or natural gas. So it is, in terms of temperature pollution, it is the worst fuel to use to generate electricity. We had been relying on it because we have a lot of it and it's cheap. We had been relying on it heavily, again, 51, 52% by 2005. We, as of 2023, under 19% of our electricity is being generated by coal. Do you know why?
And why is that?
Fracking. So fracking was able to find deposits of natural gas that were unavailable to us before fracking. So these same people who are honestly and sincerely concerned about the environment, who sometimes reject out of hand scientific solutions or technological solutions to technological problems, they would have said, don't frack. Fracking is such a perfect symbol for how we're degrading our natural environment, like the same thinking that leads to us sending water into fissures in the earth to crack it open to get natural gas. That's the same thinking that has led to the biggest threat to humankind, which is global warming. And so had they had their way, we wouldn't have fracked. But fracking is the most positive development that we've had in America since this became an issue. Let's say we can date it from July of 1979, when President Carter was told unequivocally this is going to happen.
Fascinating. I want to remind everybody of the title of your book. I've already kept you for quite a bit longer than I said that I would, but
Oh,
let's
Sabrina,
remind.
this is yeah, it's great to talk about this issue. Sorry to get in the way, but I'm willing to talk as long as the people who are driving tractors and running giant agribusinesses and dealing with managing the books, if we are distracting them while they're doing that difficult work, I'm happy to keep talking as long as you are.
Okay. Well, so now, and your book is out now, right? It's
That's right.
on shelves.
Yes, the paperback, what you and I are celebrating now is the paperback came out a couple of days ago.
Okay. And is that something that people can pick up at any bookstore?
Yes, and you can also pick it up through Amazon. I think that's for better or worse, that's where most books are picked up now.
Mhm.
And if you pay the $10, it will appear instantly on your phone. I read ebooks not so much out of ecological sympathy, which obviously I have, but just because they're cooler, you can search for things in them. So if it were me, I would buy the ebook.
Yes, I am very fond of my my
Yeah, of
Kindle reading
course,
that I can take with me
of course.
everywhere and have.
Your entire bookcase. Um,
Mhm.
on that score, I know we're out of time, but can I tell you just how devious opinion managers are? And so that's part of the other revenge reason behind the book.
I would love it.
Okay, so there's a brilliant man who invented the field of public relations. This is just the preamble to the cool story. He's a man named Edward Bernays, and he married Sigmund Freud's grandniece. And if you're a publicist, you make hay from that. So he made sure he was always referred to as Sigmund Freud's grandnephew, even though he was only Freud's grandnephew by marriage. He was ingenious about what he called propaganda. Back when he started doing this in the 20s, it was just a word. It didn't have negative connotations. Part of the reason it has negative connotations is people like the National Socialist Party, the chief strategist for the Nazis, for better, I mean, one hates to say that word, it feels bad in the mouth. Their chief strategist was a man named Joseph Goebbels, and he referred to Bernays' work as his Bible. Bernays, he helped public smoking by women was considered a tremendous faux pas in the 1920s. And so what Bernays organized as a way to double the potential market for cigarettes was a demonstration called Torches for Freedom, where women would march down Fifth Avenue a day after Easter, saying, to demonstrate our commitment to women's rights, we're going to smoke cigarettes in public. They felt they were marching for women's suffrages and for women's suffrage and also for increasing women's civil rights. But in fact, it was a protest designed by the tobacco industry. Anyway, so that same brilliant person who Joseph Goebbels referred to Bernays' work as his Bible. He was hired in the 1950s by the American Booksellers Association because with TV and movies, the people who print books were nervous that there wouldn't be enough readers left soon. They had seen their market share drop and they were very anxious. And so they turned to Edward Bernays, who is the nation's best convincer. Then they said, we'll pay you, get people to read more books. Do you know what his solution was, Sabrina?
What's that?
His solution was not to find celebrity authors or to put them on TV or to promote specific books. He instead turned to the National Home Builders Association and he said, look, I can put you in partnership this way. Can you make sure that every new house you build, please make sure it comes with a built-in set of bookshelves? Because then people will feel they have to go out and buy those books to fill those shelves. Those are the kinds of fingerprints we often find on our most intimate or our most important opinions. And that was the other revenge reason that I went about writing this great story or telling this great story that's in the book.
That in itself was a great story
Yeah.
about the bookshelves. I had never heard about that.
Yeah. But it's wild that That is a little bit like Frank Luntz renaming global warming climate
Mhm.
change. There are people whose job it is to change your opinion without you realizing where the idea came from. Did you ever see Inception, that Leo DiCaprio movie?
Years ago.
Yeah, so there are people, it's set in a future with better technology than ours. People can jump into your dreams and make you think that your idea of going away for the summer or your idea of sharing the blueprints for a cool new phone with your sharpest digital phone competitor, you would think it was your idea, but secretly they had climbed into your dreams and planted it there.
Mhm.
That seems like science fiction, but that basically is what public relations is about. And it is the wonderful professionalism on a certain level and the unsettling professionalism on another level that has resulted in things like our not quite being able to do something effective about the fact that we're making it much harder to grow and harvest crops over the last 50 and 70 years.
Fascinating. Once again, the title of your book?
The Parrot and the Igloo, Climate and the Science of Denial.
Well, I want to thank you for taking so much time with me today. This was a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
I loved it too, Sabrina. Thanks for having me and the book on. It was a great conversation.
Thank you to author David Lipsky for that conversation. And if you'd like to hear more conversations like this, be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast. This is the AgNet Weekly. For AgNet Media, I'm Sabrina Halverson.
Continue the conversation online by following Sabrina Halverson on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn. And get more agricultural news at southeastagnet.com and agnetwest.com. This has been the AgNet Weekly from AgNet Media. Thank you for tuning in.